Imagine waking up one morning and finding footprints in the snow. Nothing unusual about that, except these footprints begin at the edge of a forest. They lead directly to your house, and then they stop. No footprints leaving, no tracks heading back into the woods. Just a single trail coming toward your home, as if someone walked there and never left. Most people would call the police. Most people would tell their neighbors. Most people would leave. But the family living at a remote farm in southern Germany in the spring of 1922 did none of those things. Instead, they stayed. They continued their daily routines. They worked. They ate. They slept. And over the following weeks, stranger things began happening. Footsteps echoed from empty rooms. Objects moved on their own. A newspaper appeared that nobody recognized. A maid became so terrified she quit her job. Then, without warning, an entire family vanished. Days later, investigators would discover one of the most disturbing crime scenes in European history. A crime so bizarre, so unsettling, that more than a century later, nobody can say with certainty who committed it, or why. This is the story of Hinterkaifeck, and before we get to the murders, we need to talk about the warnings, because looking back, it seems almost impossible that nobody realized what was coming. In the early 1920s, Germany was still recovering from the devastation of World War I. Across the countryside, thousands of farming families lived simple lives. Most people knew their neighbors. Most villages were small. News traveled quickly, and strangers rarely went unnoticed. About 70 kilometers north of Munich sat a tiny farming property known as Hinterkaifeck. The name wasn't really a town, it was more of a location. A small, isolated farm situated between woods and fields. The nearest village was close enough to visit, but far enough away that the farm often felt completely alone, especially at night. The farm belonged to a man named Andreas Gruber. At 63 years old, Andreas was known throughout the area, and not necessarily for good reasons. Neighbors described him as stern, difficult, quick-tempered, the kind of man who preferred giving orders rather than receiving them. He had spent his entire life working the land. Years of labor had hardened him physically, but according to many accounts, it had hardened him emotionally as well. Living with Andreas was his wife, Cecilia, their widowed daughter, Victoria, and Victoria's 2 children. 7-year-old Cecilia, named after her grandmother, and little Joseph, a boy barely 2 years old. Together they formed a household of 6 people, a family living a quiet rural existence, at least on the surface. Because beneath that surface, there were already tensions. Rumors had followed the Gruber family for years. Some were whispered behind closed doors, others were discussed openly. The details varied depending on who was telling the story. But one thing remained consistent. Many people in the surrounding villages viewed the family as unusual. Some even considered them troubled. Still, whatever private issues existed inside the household, life continued. The farm functioned. The animals were fed. The fields were maintained. And from a distance everything appeared normal, until strange things started happening. The first sign was easy to dismiss, a missing key. At some point during the winter of 1922, Andreas noticed that one of the house keys had disappeared. People lose keys all the time. Maybe it had been misplaced. Maybe one of the children had moved it. Maybe it had fallen somewhere in the barn. The family searched. Nothing. The key never turned up. Today, losing a key might be annoying. In rural Germany in 1922, it was more concerning. A missing key meant somebody could potentially enter your property. But Andreas wasn't the kind of person who worried easily, so life went on. Days passed, then weeks. The missing key became just another forgotten inconvenience, until something else happened, something harder to explain. One morning, Andreas stepped outside and noticed footprints in the snow. The tracks emerged from the direction of the forest. That alone wasn't unusual. Hunters sometimes passed through the area. Travelers occasionally crossed nearby land. But as Andreas followed the prints, a chill ran through him. The tracks led directly toward the farm, right toward the house. And then they stopped. No return tracks, no second trail, nothing. The person who made them appeared to have arrived, but never left. Andreas searched the surrounding area. He checked nearby buildings. He looked around the property. Nobody, no stranger, no explanation, just footprints ending at his home. When he later mentioned the incident to neighbors, some reportedly suggested an obvious possibility. Maybe someone was hiding nearby. Maybe someone had taken shelter in an unused structure. Maybe someone was watching the farm. But Andreas dismissed the idea, at least publicly. Privately, however, he seemed disturbed, because in the days that followed, more incidents occurred. The sounds came next. At first they were faint, the kind of noises old houses make. A creak, a thump, a shifting floorboard. Nothing alarming, except the noises seemed to come from the attic. Andreas investigated. Nothing. No animals, no intruder, no damaged beams. Everything appeared normal. Then the sounds returned, again and again. Footsteps, slow, measured, moving overhead. Imagine lying in bed late at night, the house silent around you, then hearing someone walk above your head. Not running, not stumbling, walking, as though they know exactly where they're going. Andreas climbed into the attic repeatedly. Each time he found nothing, no evidence, no explanation, yet the sounds continued. If this were a horror movie, this would be the moment the family leaves. But real life rarely works that way. People rationalize. They explain things away. They tell themselves there must be a logical answer. And that's exactly what happened. The family stayed, the noises continued, and then something even stranger occurred. A newspaper appeared. One day, Andreas discovered a newspaper on the property. The problem was simple. Nobody in the household subscribed to that newspaper. Nobody recognized it. Nobody knew where it came from. It hadn't arrived with the mail. No neighbor claimed ownership. It was simply there, waiting. Most people might shrug and throw it away. But when you combine a mysterious newspaper with missing keys, unexplained footprints, and footsteps in the attic, the picture becomes harder to ignore. Someone, somewhere, had been close to the farm, close enough to leave things behind, close enough to enter the property, maybe even close enough to enter the house itself. And still, nobody called authorities. At least, not in any serious way. The family carried on, completely unaware of how dangerous their situation might already be. Then came the maid, and she noticed things the family either couldn't see or refused to acknowledge. The Grubers employed a maid to help around the farm. Working at Hinterkaifeck wasn't easy. The property was isolated, the work was demanding, and the atmosphere could be uncomfortable, especially after the strange incidents began. Over time, the maid became increasingly nervous. She reportedly heard unusual sounds. She sensed something was wrong, something she couldn't explain. Eventually, her fear grew so intense that she quit. Not because of poor pay, not because of difficult work, but because she believed the property was haunted. Now, whether she literally believed in ghosts is impossible to know. Stories change over time. Details become distorted, but the important fact remains. She was frightened enough to leave, and once she left, finding a replacement proved difficult. Few people wanted to work on an isolated farm with a reputation for strange occurrences. Yet eventually, another maid agreed to take the position. She would arrive on March 31st, 1922, her first day, a fresh start, a normal job. She had no way of knowing she was walking into one of the most infamous crime scenes in history. March arrived cold and gray. Winter was beginning to loosen its grip. The fields remained quiet. The forests stood dark against the horizon. From a distance, Hinterkaifeck looked peaceful, almost picturesque. A farmhouse, a barn, animals, family. Nothing suspicious, nothing threatening. Nothing that hinted at what was coming. But somewhere within those fields, within those woods, or perhaps even within the buildings themselves, someone may already have been watching, waiting. Learning routines, studying habits, observing when people slept, when they worked, when they were alone. Because the events that followed would later convince many investigators of a terrifying possibility. The murders at Hinterkaifeck may not have been spontaneous. They may have been planned, carefully, patiently, by someone who knew the family far better than anyone realized. And if that theory is true, then the killer was likely already there, long before the first victim died. On the morning of March 31st, 1922, the new maid arrived at the farm. She greeted the family. She settled into her duties. She began what she believed would be an ordinary day. It would be the last ordinary day anyone at Hinterkaifeck would ever experience, because within hours something would happen inside that farmhouse. Something so brutal, so horrifying, that even seasoned investigators would struggle to comprehend it, and the mystery surrounding those deaths would survive for more than 100 years, leaving behind one question that remains unanswered to this day: who was watching the farm, and why?